We are live.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to everybody in the room and to those.
Now you can.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming today. For those in the room, welcome. For those online, sorry for the slight delay. But we are here from School Food Matters. My name is Stephanie Slater, and we're going to talk to you about school food policy and food education in the UK. So, next slide, please. That's me. I have it here. Okay. So, we have a series of speakers. I'll be kicking off with experience of setting up a charity. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Sean Turner, who's going to be talking about how our work influences policy. And then I'm going to hand over to Christina Adain, who's going to tell her story about being a campaigner in this space, and Louise Foreman from Impact on Urban Health. So let's start at the beginning. So School Food Matters, there are a lot of words on that slide. But in a nutshell, we exist to teach children about food and improve access to healthy, sustainable food during their time at school. And I think we have a slight technical hitch. I will just pause for a moment. We could be back on track at any moment. But there we go, we're back. So that's a lot of words, but basically what we do are two things. We teach children about food. We work in schools every single day. And the lessons we learn from working with children, with working with teachers, with working with families, we take to policymakers because we want to change the food experience for every child in every school. We do that through a series of programs. We want children to engage with the joy of food, and one of the best ways of doing that with school children is hands-on activity in schools. So you can see here cooking programs. We run a whole series of cooking programs from early years, which is all about sensual education, talking about taste and smell, and then we move on to skills as we go through each of the academic years. We also like children to get outside. We want them to get their hands dirty. We want them to connect with where food really comes from, and that comes from the soil, not the supermarket. And we do that from getting children to sow seed and watch things grow. I don't know whether any of you were in the session this morning with Dermot Gavin, talking about trying to reconnect children with where their food comes from and that whole disconnect we sometimes see. So the best way of connecting children with where their food comes from is to get them digging in the garden. The other very important thing we heard about in the session this morning were pollinators. Without pollinators, we have no food. And that's a really important lesson for children to learn, because often you can get small children going outside and being scared of bugs and creepy crawlies and things that fly. But we put them in these beautiful suits, we send them out to an apiary, and they end up actually picking up the frames from the beehives and seeing the bees do their amazing work. This young man here has grown that beetroot and he's selling it at his local community market. The reason we do this is we want children to understand the value of food, to understand that it's a challenge to get food from the soil to the market, and in the hope that they'll understand the challenges, they'll understand the disappointments sometimes, but they can reconnect and maybe not take it for granted. It's a really important thing for us for children to value food and realise that it's not abundant, and there are some people who can't access food, so we have to not waste it. So that's one of our programs called Young Marketeers. And it tends to engage children that aren't necessarily interested in gardening if they know they can make a buck out of what they grow. So it's a real exchange. It's enterprise. They're learning enterprise skills. They're learning about product development, and they're learning about the value of food. There are some numbers. We've worked with lots and lots of children. We work at different scales. We might work with a class of 30. We might work with 1 million children, supporting them during lockdown, during COVID. So we're working on lots of different levels. But it all started with this. It started with school food. And it started because children my own children at their local primary school were served appalling food. So as a parent, having lived abroad and going back to London, the first thing I heard when I went into my children's primary school was, sorry about the smell, that's lunch. And there was a real fait accompli, there was a real feeling that they couldn't do anything about it. And because I knew nothing about school food or public sector procurement, how food ended up on the plate, I thought I could tackle that no problem. And I thought the whole thing would be done in about 6 weeks. My background is in film production. We used to do things quickly. So 15 years later, and we're still, obviously, great changes have happened in those 15 years, which I can tell you a bit about, but it all started with this plate of food. And I think it's really important just to pause and have a look at that, and a big prize for anybody that can identify what's in the bottom left-hand corner. Because the saddest moment was talking to the school cooks who prepared that plate. They actually didn't know what that was in the bottom left-hand corner. They'd gone into school meal provision because they love children, they love cooking, and they were asking to reheat packaged food and just dump it on a tray. So we knew we could do better. So the happy news is it didn't quite take 15 years, but we got to a place 4 years later by reworking the contract where the food was freshly prepared in 38 different schools across the London borough where my kids were at school. And the most significant thing about this plate of food, which is high quality, high welfare, it was cheaper than the processed frozen meal that they were preparing before. So because of the journey we had taken, I say we at the time, it was one pushy parent, but it's now grown into a fabulous charity of 23 people. But because we had a bit of a story to tell, because it was a bit of a sort of parent crusade at the time, I was asked to be part of the government school food plan, the expert panel that put together an action plan for head teachers to transform school food. And good things happened. So what we learned during that process was that in every school where excellent food is served, the head teacher leads the change. You have to have buy-in from the top. The school has to take a whole school approach. That means everybody in that school has bought into the transformation process and gets behind the need for change. So you don't get the PE teacher running down the corridor with a packet of crisps and a can of Coke. It's all about healthy messages for the children in that school. And the last thing, which sounds obvious, but it has been ignored, is seeing food through the eyes of a child, talking to the customers. And it sounds a little bit simplistic, but I actually was at a school where they couldn't engage the reception children, the little children, in the canteen. They were scared, they didn't want to go in, they wouldn't have a school meal. And when we walked around, we realised the counter was set so high they couldn't actually see the food. So it's often really simplistic changes that need to happen that create a real interest in food in school. So 3 big things came out of the school food plan. We got universal infant free school meals. That means every child from 4 to 7 gets a free school meal. I shouldn't say free, we should say funded. It's not free, it's paid for by government. And that means that you have all of the infants' children in a school in England eating together, and we're normalising healthy eating. Everybody's eating a meal that has been balanced nutritionally. School food standards, they're mandatory. You will remember back in the day, 2005, Jamie Oliver being on the telly, and he pointed out that there were regulations for dog food, but not for school food. So he was one of the architects of the first school food standards. What we did in 2013 was to simplify them, and the quest was to get the school food standards on a tea towel, which we succeeded in doing. We wanted to make it really simple so that cooks could be creative, but make sure they had a balanced meal. And finally, cooking on the curriculum. You see some of those young people experiencing food in the earlier slides, but not all schools get to do that. They should. It's mandatory. It's on the curriculum, but we know delivery is a bit patchy, so lots of work to be done there. But that's enough from me. We're going to hear some stories from some of the children that we work with. Hopefully there will be some sound on this.
We the children believe that everything's in the garden.
I can see you've got a wonderful garden here. I am here to do some honeybee planting.
In our garden we grow apples,
Marguerite strawberry,
carrot, rhubarb, plums. That's about it really.
Who has done some planting before?
It showed me how vegetables and herbs have grown. I didn't know before, because I've never been to a garden like that.
I didn't know how some vegetables grew. Like spoiler, I didn't know I thought they grew on the ground. They don't.
I need some volunteers to carry some of these.
It makes me feel proud of what I've done and what everyone else has done because it's what we as gardeners can achieve to grow. We the children believe that
Food lessons are as important as maths and English.
We're going to be using fresh ingredients today, which are, typical sort of, you can see, carrots, potatoes, quite sort of humble ingredients that can be grown almost anywhere.
I love cooking in school. I feel like it's one of the best parts of the day. I wouldn't miss it for anything. I love it so much.
If you imagine that when you have that with curry, which is like full of flavour, this is like a contrast to it.
Sometimes, maybe if I go home, my siblings want to eat, but they don't really know what to do in the kitchen as they are older than me, but they didn't get the chance to learn how to go to the kitchen. Why do you hold the knives the way you do?
People should have the opportunity if they want to further their education in cooking because it can lead to so many different paths.
I'd love to learn how to make salads because every time I make a salad, I cut my finger. We the children believe that
We should all have the right to free school meals.
this is a very special school. Everyone in this school gets access to free school meals, and that makes me feel grateful for where I live. Having filling school lunches makes it easier to concentrate on lessons.
We can't really work on an empty stomach.
You can chat with friends whilst you eat, and it's just a relaxing time.
Some people are struggling, and even though they might not see it to school, it's just easier for everyone to have free school meals.
If they run on a whole lot at school, yeah, they'll have some energy for the day because they will eat something instead of just going on an empty stomach for the whole day. As some kids are not as privileged as others.
I think it's important that every child across the country gets a free meal because if you don't really have enough money to get breakfast and dinner, you at least get a meal at school. So you get at least one a day.
That's a world premiere. You're the first people that have seen that film. So we made it for our 15th birthday, but it's become so important right now. So I'm going to hand over to Sean, who's going to explain the policy side.
Hello, my name is Sean and I also work at School Food Matters and I work doing policy and campaigning. And as Stephanie has highlighted, we do a lot of work in schools, and actually that work in schools, working with teachers, with children, with parents, informs what we then do in terms of our policy and our campaigns. So when we speak to the government in the UK, we're speaking with the authority, the people who actually work in the schools. And we know what children like to do, we know what they care about, and we know what's important for children. And so these are some articles from our website, and these are the kind of things that we then take to government, having been in schools and seen the problems firsthand. So we know that too many children are missing out on a good lunch at school. We know that there are real problems with the way food is bought and the way it is produced for schools in terms of sustainability and that cycle from farm to fork. When we go to influence these big policy pieces, they often culminate in documents like this. So this was a government commission document that was produced a couple of years ago in the UK. It's called the National Food Strategy. It was going to be the solution to all of the problems with the food system, whether they were to do with people or planet health. And you can see Stephanie was quoted on the cover of this document when it was published. We had taken our school food findings, we'd fed them in, and in fact, several of the leading recommendations this report made were all about school food. It valued school food and it recognised that school food does matter. Here is an example of one of our project officers, my colleague Sabine. And Sabine was working in a school, this is in London, and she works with the children and the teachers every day, but still she knows that that learning needs to be translated into government action. You see her being interviewed on the news and she says there needs to be support coming from government. There's the will on the ground, people want to see change, but the support is coming from the wrong places at the minute. So, what is school food in the United Kingdom like? This map shows that you don't have to worry about all of the text on it, but basically the system is broken up by the different nations within the UK. So we're mostly going to focus on England, and the main reasons for that are that is where most of our work is. That is also where the government in London have the power to influence the policy. And also England is considerably further behind than the rest of the UK. So in England, for you to get your meals paid for, there are 3 routes, effectively. The first route is that you are aged 4 to 7, and the government will pay for all 4 to 7-year-olds school lunch. The second route, and this was a hard-fought win by campaigners that I'll come back onto, if you are from a family that doesn't have what's called recourse to public funds, so if you don't get support from the government and it's an immigration-based condition, then if you are within a certain income bracket, you will also get given a free school meal. For everybody else, the conditions to get a free school meal are that your parents must be on state support or benefits, and it's called universal credit now in the UK. And everybody in your house, when you combine all of the money they earn over the course of a year, that number cannot exceed £7,400, which is about 7,400 euros. So if you earn more than that, everybody, if both of your parents, your siblings earn more than that £7,400 number, which isn't a lot of money, then you do not get given that free school meal. Now, for reference of how many children and what condition of living a lot of children are in there, about a quarter of children are below that threshold. So about 1 in 4 children, about 22.5%, get that free school meal. So there's a quarter of children growing up in households where everybody's income combined is less than £7,400. This system is not working at the minute, and we know this. We know this because 1 in 3 children living in poverty are not eligible for a free school meal. So that threshold, that 7,400, is so low that it doesn't even cover everybody who is classed as being in poverty. That's about 800,000 children living in the UK in poverty, and the school will not give them food paid for. We know that school food is the best option for children because when we surveyed packed lunches, so when children bring their own food in, which is the only option if you can't afford a meal, we know that 98% of them, over that number, do not meet nutritional standards. They usually consist of crisps and processed foods, and they do not meet the legally maintained standards that school food has to. And those standards, even though they're legally maintained, are outdated in and of themselves. They require minimum servings of meat portions, which are contrary to the government's own climate and sustainability objectives. They have different considerations about fried foods, and there's a whole load of things that could be done to make these standards more nutritionally valuable and also more sustainable for procurement of food. And finally, the funding has not risen with inflation. So I'm not even talking about in the past 12 months where we've seen inflation due to the invasion of Ukraine and other pressures. The funding has not risen with inflation. So there is not enough money in the system as it stands. What are we going to do about it? Well, I'll save you that slide, spoiler there. Hello. So we've learned what we know from schools and we've come up with some problems in the system and we thought we need to change them. So we pulled together everybody in the system. There are dozens of organisations working in school food in the UK, and they have all been asking for similar things, but now we thought they need to ask with one voice. And so we united a whole range of organisations with support from Impact on Urban Health, who you'll hear from in a minute. We've got Bite Back, where Christina works, and on there we've got caterers, we've got head teachers organisations, we've got university academics, we've got poverty organisations, and about 35 organisations have come together from across the school food system, and we spent about 2 years deciding what the problems are and what the solutions are. And we've come up with 5 what we call pillars. And these are the things that all of the problems in the school food system in the UK and all of the solutions can be boxed into. The first one is entitlement. So who is entitled to a free school meal? Too many children are missing out on good nutrition. The second one is about procurement. So how is this food procured? What are the procurement systems? How far does that food travel? Does it come frozen from Wales, or is it made freshly on site from a local producer? Accountability and quality assurance. Those standards that were legally maintained had no checks. Nobody was checking whether the food was meeting the standards. Uptake, so this is key. We want more people eating the food. We want the food to be enjoyable. We want school food to be seeming to be the best option for children and young people. And finally, funding. As I said, the system doesn't have enough money in to deliver the outputs it wants. So we've campaigned, we've argued amongst ourselves, we've thrashed these things out, and we've settled on 5 pillars, and we've settled on key asks for the government. And then we've taken them to the government and presented with our united voice, from head teachers to charities to catering companies, and we've said this is what we want. And we've had some successes. So earlier this year, the UK government, and they cited our united voice as being a really useful thing for them to be able to interact with. And they've said that in one of the policy documents they announced earlier this year, they're going to commit to inspecting school food. And they'll ask schools to present how they carry out this whole school approach to food that Stephanie mentioned earlier. So that accountability pillar, that's really important to have any good system, is now starting to move forwards, which is really great progress. This was the white paper. They also had some money for food teachers, and there was support for school governors, because these are the people who sit at the top of the school on the school boards, and they have responsibility for the legal and statutory requirements of the school. So this was a real good win. A few months later, the government produced a food strategy, which was in response to the national food strategy I mentioned earlier. This was much more disappointing. They failed to meet any of the asks of their own national food strategy, and in response to the document they had asked to be commissioned, they only considered really 2 of the points we'd asked for, and those final 2, they were probably going to do them anyway. It wasn't a big commitment. But the main ones were we wanted more children to have free school meals, we wanted better food education, and we wanted better standards in schools, and they had not followed through on those there. What do we want next? So the 35 organisations, and then some other organisations who were involved campaigning with Marcus Rashford, the footballer, in the pandemic, asking for more children to have access to food. We've all come together and we've started a new campaign. This was launched last week. In the UK, it's gathering quite a lot of media support, and it's called Feed the Future. And we have 2 asks. The second ask is our long-term goal, and that is for every child in every school to have a school meal, a healthy, nutritious, sustainable school meal. But in the immediate instance, we need the government to make sure that everybody living in poverty, at least, should access good nutrition. We're talking to teachers who are watching children eating rubbers in the classrooms. We're talking to children from better off families having to subsidise their peers so they can eat. And this is a real sorry state of affairs. And the government continues to neglect these families across the country. So we ask in the first instance that free school meals are available to everybody who gets state benefits. That's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Louise now, who can tell you some more from Impact and Urban Health perspective.
Thank you, Sean and Stephanie. Perfect. So, hi everyone, my name's Louise and I work for an organisation called Impact on Urban Health, which is part of a UK-based foundation called Guides and St Thomas Foundation. So at Impact on Urban Health, our aim is to make inner city areas healthier places for people to live, work and play. And the way that we try and achieve that is by tackling the wider inequalities that shape people's health in those places. So whether we're looking at the health effects of air pollution, or we're looking at the speed at which people progress from living with one health condition to living with multiple health conditions, or we're exploring children's experiences of mental health and well-being, we can see across all of these issues and so many others the way that they intersect with underlying social and economic inequalities, which then play out as health inequalities. And we know that that is not inevitable. So what we do is we try and work with a really wide range of different partners across public, private and charitable and non-profit sector to tackle those inequalities and try to build greater health equity. So a lot of our work at the moment does focus on child health. We firmly believe that all children should have access to the things that they need to be healthy, no matter where they grow up or what kind of family background they come from. And that includes having access to enough healthy and nutritious food. So one of our programs specifically focuses on trying to make sure that healthy food options are more accessible and affordable, and at the same time to try and stem the flood of unhealthy food options which families and children are bombarded with in cities. And in doing this, we aim to break the link that currently exists between a family's income level and the nutritional quality of the food that they can access. Within that programme, one of our core focus areas is school food. And the reason we see school food as such an important piece of the jigsaw is that in a place where all children are required to be formally educated up to the age of 16, and for the vast majority of children that means going to school, schools could and should be places where we can start to level the playing field in terms of ensuring that all children can access healthy food to address dietary inequalities. Unfortunately, that's not currently always the case. And that's partly due to some of the factors that Sean and Stephanie described in terms of the eligibility threshold for families accessing free food at school being incredibly restrictive, but it's also to do with how variable the quality of food can be in schools. So we've heard how whilst we have national school food standards which exist on paper, in practice we know that there's absolutely brilliant, delicious and healthy food being served up, and there's also a lot of not so great food that's still being served to children. And this is despite the brilliant work and commitment from school staff teams and from school catering teams. But as Sean was describing with those 5 pillars, there are a number of weaknesses and gaps in the wider school food system that are contributing to this continued inconsistency in quality. And I should also say that all of these kind of points around both the opportunities and the challenges within school food were really further highlighted through our experiences during the pandemic so far, in that we really saw what an important role schools were playing in continuing to support child health, including through the distribution of food throughout school closures and lockdowns. But we also saw so starkly that wide range in terms of what kind of food was being distributed. And we want to change that. And I'm now going to very briefly touch on 3 different approaches that we're taking in collaboration with partners. Hi, come on in. To try and make sure that all children can and do access healthy food when they go to school. Welcome.
Sorry.
I think we've got some chairs over here. So the first approach is about working with individual schools to create a healthy food environment and to embed a good school food culture. So this really directly connects with what you've already heard about Stephanie's own story and the brilliant work of School Food Matters. The reason that it's important for us to support work with individual schools is not just that as a place-based foundation, we want to make sure that we are investing in projects that have a direct impact in the specific part of London that we call home, but also from an inequalities perspective, by taking that very focused approach, we can make sure together that the kind of support that School Food Matters offers can be taken up by schools who have a large number of families who are living on low incomes and who therefore face more barriers to accessing healthy food. We also know that every school is unique in its circumstances, its strengths, its challenges, and especially in the people who make up the school community. Hello, welcome, come on in. We've still got some space. And in taking this kind of very focused approach, we can work closely with the members of that school food community to make sure that changes that are being brought about are really with and by them and are therefore more likely to be relevant, effective and sustainable for that school. But of course, through working with individual schools, we're also building up our understanding of the bigger picture in terms of what are the common themes, the wider patterns, and as Sean was describing, those kind of structural drivers of problems with school food that are beyond an individual school's control or responsibility. So that connects with our second approach. Hi, welcome. And that's around exactly that. So identifying and addressing the wider structural drivers of poor nutritional quality in the school food system. So you've already heard from Sean about what some of that work looks like with the National School Food Review Group, which is very focused on national policy change to address some of those issues that he outlined through the 5 pillars. But there are also opportunities at a regional or local government level to be engaging with those structural drivers. So another example is a partnership that we currently have with Southwark Council, who are the local government body for one of the London boroughs where we're based. Southwark Council have for many years actually been using their own public health funding to ensure that all of their primary school age children can access a free meal when they go to school. So that obviously demonstrates a really brilliant commitment to them to supporting child health and tackling inequalities. But similarly to the national picture, what they found through research with us is that actually that quality of what's being served up does still have that variation. So the investment that they're making in every child isn't always translating into a nutritious meal for each individual. So we've been working with them to look at what are the kind of structural ways that they can try and address that. One example of one of the kind of aspects of the project at the moment is around putting together a more comprehensive support and training package for the school staff members who are responsible for procuring or contracting the school food, to make sure they're really informed and supported about how to do that in a way that is compliant with the school food standards. Or another example is that they're also looking at whether they could set up joint procurement opportunities for schools to enable them to buy food together, so that rather than each individual school having to kind of sort that out themselves, they can do that collectively, and that might enable them to access better prices, for example, for healthy food items. And then the final approach, welcome, I'm actually not going to say very much about, because I'm about to hand over to Christina and she's much better placed to talk about this than I am. But it's around supporting children and young people themselves to advocate and co-produce the changes that they want to see. And I think this really brings me back to where I started around talking about impact on urban health's focus on inequalities, because we firmly believe that if you're trying to address inequality, you're not going to be able to do that effectively unless people who have direct experience of that issue have a seat at the table and are able to shape and lead change. So that's why it's really important to us that we're supporting organisations like Bite Back, who are supporting youth-led movements, and organisations like School Food Matters, who are doing really excellent co-production with children and families. So I'll stop there, hand over to you, Christina.
Thanks so much, Louise. Cool. So hi everyone, my name is Christina Ajana, and I am campaigner in residence at Bite Back 2030. So I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about my journey, why youth advocacy in food particularly is so important, but also just zoom out and look at the wider food system in the UK and why free school meals are so important. So this is Bite Back. We're a youth-led movement aiming to fight the injustices of the food industry in the UK. Our aim is to halve child obesity by 2030. And my journey started at its inception when Jamie Oliver, one of our co-founders, essentially set out a call to bring all young people into food. I applied because my manager at the time was like, this is something you're clearly interested in, because I was in climate advocacy at the time, trying to discover the relationship between climate and food. And I really went into it with a very individual mindset. So I thought that it was my responsibility, what I was eating, and looking at sustainability and do I go vegan? Like, is that how I make change? Like, it was very much an individual kind of campaigny advocacy journey. But then I realized within the first couple of days of Bite Back's training that it was actually a whole system out there kind of rigged against me. I get asked a lot of the time, why do you campaign about food? Like, you're a woman, like you're black, like, there's the climate issue. There are so many other issues that I should be talking about, right? Food is one of the hidden injustices. So it took me to join Bite Back to actually understand that I lived in a food desert for half my life, that I'm twice as likely to develop obesity because of where I live, that I'm likely to die around 10 years earlier than someone living in a more affluent area, just because of where I live. Like, it's an absolute postcode lottery. And so, by the way, for those that don't know, a food desert is an area, a high street filled with junk food, and there's little to no access to nutritious food at an affordable price. So that was my environment. I was also a recipient of free school meals, and that is kind of why I joined. And there was also other things that I'll get into. Okay, so again, this is a food desert. This looks very much like my high street, and I have little siblings, and we all go to school in a place called Westminster, which is like kind of very central London, but I live in South London. So when I make the trip to school, when they make the trip to school, we go from this to a very wealthy area that's got all these healthy options, right? That aren't accessible to us because they're too expensive, and they aren't made to be attractive to us either. So our idea of healthy and nutritious growing up was very boring, and we thought of junk food as sexy and cool, and because that's what was marketed to us. In our supermarkets, we are bombarded with junk food. Notice how all the kids' cereals are at the bottom, and they're the ones that have the highest intake of sugar. That's not on purpose. They're poisoning these companies are poisoning our children before they even reach teenagehood. So this is the kind of stuff that really got me angry, particularly knowing like my brother and sister would have a bowl of cereal, 100 grams, 70 grams of sugar in one sitting, and then go to school. So this is like the wider food environment that I'm talking about. Again, advertising. We launched a report that showed 16 billion advertisements were bombarding young people in the past 4 years in the UK, which is equivalent to 500 ads per second, which is shocking and horrifying. And this is online, and on our phones, emails, social media feeds, celebrity endorsements. It's all over. And this brings me to why free school meals is so important. Because of our wider food environment, because of how just filled with junk it is, sometimes, most of the time, school and a hot meal at school is the only opportunity so many young people can get for a hot, nutritious meal. That person, that little boy on the screen there, is Victor. He's a 15-year-old youth board member at Bite Back, and he posted a blog that essentially told his story, and he said that there are times where he's had to go days on end because he didn't have any food to eat, and so when he goes into school from his low income inner city high street, which is filled with junk food, goes into school, isn't able to afford school meals because he isn't in that £7,400 threshold. He then, with his little money that he has, goes out and gets junk food because the chicken shop's right next to the school, right? This is the life that we're setting up for our young people. And this is why Bite Back exists, because we're fed up. We're absolutely tired of it. Here's another story of Bilal, who's 14 from Manchester. He wants to be a doctor and doesn't have the energy to concentrate in class because he has to skip meals. So, I've told you about the importance of free school meals, and so has everyone else on the panel. But I want to tell you the importance of youth advocacy. So Bite Back started in 2019, and the first time we kind of started campaigning about free school meals was when it was during lockdown, and I started this petition to extend free school meal provisions over the holidays because the government decided not to, even though we were in a global pandemic and there was no money coming in for families. And that petition went crazy. It hit 450,000 signatures online and was backed by, huge celebrities. And then it got, that's what led to the Marcus Rashford campaign to end child food poverty in the long term. So that youth kind of voice was the first that we've heard of, right, in 2020, in a space that has existed since 1906. So free school meals was first made mandatory in 1906 in the UK, and yet it's only 100 years later that we're seeing young people actually talk about this provision that directly impacts them. And we've seen since Bite Back's existence how incredible and incredibly impactful young people have been in this space. So we've been invited to 10 Downing by the senior advisor for health at the time. We've been on media countless times. Like we've been invited to the biggest events by corporates, even not just government and other people in the food space. So it's super important to empower young people within the food space, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, because we are made to feel ashamed because of the food we eat and being on free school meals. It was a very stigmatized thing, and it's still really upsetting when I'm hearing those same stories that I heard and those same stories that Jamie Oliver was talking about 15 years ago still happen today with our new people, Victor and Bilal, are 14, 15, still going through the same things that were happening decades ago, right? So we've really shown that youth advocacy in this space has made a change. Go on. No, it's fine. And so, being a genuinely youth-led organisation is hugely impactful in doing so. Come in. And just to tell you a bit about our structure, we're a national youth board, and we have 3 main priorities: healthy streets, screens, and schools. And then we've got local youth boards. We've just scaled up to 7, who essentially they focus on campaigns based in their local area. And that's how we create impact, by pushing forward these voices on our youth boards. And then they then work collaboratively together to create ideas like sports sponsorship, junk food marketing, and obviously most importantly free school meals, to ensure that every child in the UK gets, fulfills their right to a healthy life. So yeah, that's us. Thank you.
So I think we have some time for some questions, and I don't want you to be shy. So I'm going to ask the people in the room, has anybody got questions? And to encourage you to speak up and ask questions, we have prizes. Yeah. I have bought from London our first move into merchandise, and we have some tea towels designed by the young people that do our programme. So I think I have about 6 here. And look at these beautiful designs. These are all done by children. And we've resized them, but these are hand drawn by the children that do our programme. So who's going to ask a question?
I had a question before I saw the tea towels. Now I know. So, I just want to start by saying a really big thank you. I grew up in the UK, I grew up in London. I left about 10 years ago. And I really see in the last 10 years, the kind of all the organizations you were talking about, that there's become a food movement in the UK. And like, let's all be honest, like the UK isn't a country that's known for food. And I think partly it's unfortunate this has come out because of the levels of child poverty and because of the current government and the kind of inaction that's happened. But I think it's, sorry, was it Ben? Sorry, Sean. Sorry. And when you were talking about the fact that like I really took the message home about the kind of coming together as a coalition and actually going to the government as one voice and kind of being listened to as one voice. So just kind of maybe like, you know, following a little bit of what's been going on in the UK in the last few years, like a thank you to all of you, because I think it's an incredible movement that's going on that I think other countries could really be learning a lot from. I guess my question is a little bit like, at the moment, the UK, the British political situation is interesting, to say the least, and it's just things are changing on a daily and a weekly basis. Like, how do you respond to that? You know, like you said, getting those, I imagine getting those 5 key messages took a lot of work, but you're probably having to respond to just things emerging the whole time. And how do you do that, especially considering the number of organizations that are involved?
I think we have to do it with a lot of patience and a lot of tenacity, and partly because we don't know who to lobby right now.
Yeah.
This is the biggest problem, is we've had so many reshuffles and so many changes in leadership and so many changes in each of the departments we work with. So we work with health, we work with education, we work with DEFRA, we work with the Cabinet Office, and every time we look, there's somebody new. So, but the important thing is that we stay on message. We want to appear to be helpful. We want to be the part of the solution. So we want to help them to come to us, because Christina, Sean, and Louise and I, we have been in this space for a long time now, and we know what works. So it's about being really consistent with your messaging and being helpful and being optimistic, which sometimes is a little bit hard right now. But Christina, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think Louise and I were talking about how campaigning is it's such a reactionary kind of field anyway, where like you're always hanging off of a politician's last words, and like it's always about like what have they done now, we have to kind of, you know, but as you said, it's all about sticking to your message. And I think also what's really important is, and what we found at Bite Back is really impactful, is lived experience. No matter what political party they're in, like lived experience is always touching, because it's like, this could be your kid, right? So yeah, always, and remembering that there is a youth voice in it. I think like sometimes adults get so lost in like the politics of it all that they actually need a reminder that these are actual kids that we're talking about. So.
But that's a really good point Christina makes, because so many times it's about the story. You think about Marcus Rashford, the impact he had, it's because he told his story. So if we can amplify the stories of Christina's and Marcus Rashford, we get ahead of steam. And that's what the press pick up every single time. Every newspaper and every TV channel that phones School Food Matters wants a story. They want to understand the impact of government policy on the ground. Anything else to add, Sean, on that one?
No, I think it's having a clear message, and it is making everybody return to that message. So no matter what year we're in, no matter who the government is, we want the same thing, and that is every child to have access to a sustainable and healthy, nutritious meal. And we'll have different stories coming through from different people every year, but actually the answer is always the same. And making sure that everybody on all those different organisations all want exactly the same thing, and that is part of the hard work, then it's that resilience.
Excellent question. Do you want to pass that around?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to link to this point, the last points you were making. So we're talking a lot of national. Well, first of all, thank you so much, because it was very interesting, like the 3 experiences and all you're doing is very inspiring. But I was wondering more at the municipal or local level, are those, let's say, municipality representatives, etc., more keen in listening to? Because we know that at the national level it's very hard. It's very hard to have those kind of strategies that we were advocating for and have those pillars inside like national policies. But we have a lot of good examples, for example, for food procurement in Europe, like Denmark, for example, in Copenhagen or Milan, etc. Have you had any success with London, for example, or with Manchester, or with like cities more at the local level?
Probably a good one for Louise about the work in Southwark. So Louise.
I might draw you in as well, Mark. So my colleague Mark also works for Impact on Urban Health in our policy team. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right that there is a lot more opportunity at this point at that scale. And so there are examples like the project I mentioned with Southwark, where they're already a government body who really understand the kind of values and that are underpinning this work and the reason why it matters, and are looking for practical opportunities to actually make sure that the investment they're already making translates into even better outcomes. So you're absolutely right that there are people out there who are looking to do that, and Southwark certainly aren't the only local authority who are kind of more progressive in their thinking. So there are currently 4 London boroughs that are using their own funds to invest in a universal primary school offer. And I think, as well as opportunities like the project with Southwark, where we're working with them very directly to think, how can we take this even further in terms of what it's delivering? But it's also about drawing from all of those different municipalities to feed into the kind of national narrative around this. Look, we're not just saying these are the problems, we're actually, as Stephanie said, giving that optimistic, positive vision of, look, some people are already doing this is what's working well here, this is the impact it's having. So I think you're absolutely right that it's important to be connecting with the stories at that scale. I don't know if you...
That's pretty much exactly what I was going to say. I guess the only other thing I'd add is that, so one thing is obviously, there's been some fantastic local action that's happened. I guess there's a limit, unfortunately, to how much can happen at a local level, particularly when you're thinking about kind of big funding amounts. Like, there's pressures on local government in the UK, as there are everywhere. But it's not just about the evidence, it's also about the kind of momentum and kind of the voices that you're hearing. So I guess at one point it might have just been organisations like us going to central government and making this case, but actually now you're seeing local authorities or Mayor of London, for example, speak on, and I think Burnham said things similarly, seeing the situation on the ground and getting on board with this agenda, and also kind of lobbying into central government as well.
It might also be worth reflecting that School Food Matters started in that very way. So I went to our local council, and I knew that what was going to land there, they wanted to be what they described as an exemplar of sustainability. They wanted to be the best in London at sustainable food. They were importing frozen food from a factory in Wales to be reheated in London schools. It made absolutely no sense at all. So it's about finding the hook and finding what they want to do better. And it could be an unhealthy weight, it could be poverty, it could be many different things, and it's not always the same. You've just got to find the hook. And the other important message is to everybody in this room is that anyone can do this. If you have a feeling of it's not fair, there's absolutely no reason why you can't do this. I had absolutely no experience. Christina didn't think she was going to be a campaigner. And we have brought around policy change by staying on message and just really amplifying the it's not fair. A question over there.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, I missed nearly all your sessions. I'm really sorry. I've just been running through too. But it's really interesting. I follow Buyback's work for a really long time. And those of your leaders, they're so incredible. Yumna, Dev,
oh my
Ryan,
God.
yeah, they're so cool. Really look up to them. So it's really nice.
Where are you from first? Where are you?
I'm from Ireland, but living in London. So
okay.
I work with some of the leaders on a different campaign called Change through the Foundation. But I was going to ask you, what advice do you have for people who maybe come out of a school system where they're heavily reliant on those like school meals during the day, to then go into university and have no food available to them whatsoever? They have to choose the cheapest thing in the canteen. That's usually like pot noodles or something. And when they go to their university, they're kind of met with a, sorry, we've got a private contract with the canteen suppliers that lasts the next 25 years.
Excellent question, and I think I'm going to hand over to Sean for this one, but I should just tell you that the only campaign I knew that was looking at university food was called Beyond Baked Beans, which I thought was the most fantastic title for a campaign, and it was about skilling up undergrads. But Sean?
Before I worked campaigning for children's food, I used to work in university campaigning, so I have had my fair bunch of menu changes in universities. It's really hard being a student. I think it's outside of our remit here, but like there's a whole host of issues with being a student that I really do empathise with. And when in that university space, like in any public space, the people who set that space up have a real responsibility to the people using it. I think for university students, most of them tend to be over 18, and that does add some power. They don't need to get permission slips to go and do things like when we involve young people and children. I think use your union. I think what we heard worked from the School Food Matters campaign has been getting a united voice, and that can be hard in some students' unions. There's like other organisations, politics and things at play, but really use that union as best as possible and exhaust all of the opportunities that they have to lobby the university and the people who have the power. And then finally, there's direct action. If you're not happy with something in that canteen, organise some direct action, and whether that is starting out with some placards and just winding people up, or whether that's actually organising a boycott or some sort of big petition movement, there are things you can do. It's your space, the university. If you're in a university, particularly unlike the way schools organised, students are considered much more like customers, and so they're considered to be paying for that service. And I think you've got a lot more sway than you realise over the university. It just takes more than one voice.
Excellent question. Would like to get a teacher. Young lady in the orange t-shirt.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your conversation and your presentation as well. So, are there any specific strategies you are using to make this program like sustainable? Since it seems like you're trying to provide the cheapest but like the most healthy meal to all the children and students around for now UK.
Another really good question, but before I hand over possibly to maybe Sean again, talking about sustainable procurement, if you saw the earlier slide when I showed those 2 plates of food, remember the good stuff was cheaper, because there's a very simple economy of scale to be applied to this. If you produce beautiful food that's appealing to children, they'll eat it. They will choose a school lunch. Their parents will feel confident that you're feeding your children well, and then you can improve the quality of the food. You can start to look at sustainable practices. Sean pointed out that our school food standards need tweaking. There's too much meat in there. If we're going to meet our climate goals, we need to switch that. But sustainable food doesn't necessarily need to be expensive. It's just got to be clever in the way you procure it and make it appealing so that more children will eat it. Sean?
It's interesting that, like Stephanie said, often when that meal shift's been made, the more sustainable option can be cheaper, because often it's substituted meats with other proteins and things. And as we've seen growing food prices over the past few months, we've actually seen a lot of school cooks and caterers changing their menus, inadvertently becoming more sustainable because they're being priced out of other foods, whether that's because of processed foods or whether that's red meats, being priced out of those things. How do you get the food to be more sustainable? So on top level, you need those standards to be really strict, really clear. That's the government. In between the government and the school, what happens in that supply chain is really key. And what we want to do is get government investment to set up procurement hubs, so hubs near different municipalities, different schools, who can organise where the food comes from for the eaters in that area, people who are eating the food, and organise that in a way that reflects what supply is available in that area. So trying to maximise the use of local farmers, local food production workers, etc. And then finally, at the school level, young people and children are so much more bothered about the climate than anybody outside of school now. They are really keen. When we go into schools, children want to ask questions about the climate, about sustainability, about nature. And actually listening to those young people can be the biggest driver of change in a school. So if you're in a school or if you work in a school, setting up what we call student nutrition advice action group, snag group, and that was a group of young people within a school, and they would meet with like a school council, or it could be done through a school council, and they will meet with the teachers and they'll say, we're not happy about these things, and the teachers can say what. And often what comes up is sustainability issues. Children really care, and so then that will drive change, because the teachers know that they have to sell this food to the school staff, know they need to sell this food to the children, they need to eat it, and they want to reduce food waste, etc. And there's lots of good practice, local initiatives that have come from teachers and school staff talking with the pupils on the ground. So you need national policy change, you need a complete economic shift in the middle, which really needs government funding to force through, and then at a local level, involving young people in those food decisions.
Excellent question. Tita. Who next? Hello.
I was wondering, from what I've heard today, I think a lot of organizations are focusing on children, especially like younger children below the age of 7. But I was wondering, as a teenager myself, are there any like special measures or any like different organizations trying to address the hunger of, I guess, teenagers? Because around 10 and 20% of teenagers are suffering from hunger, and I was wondering what can be done or what is being done to address that issue.
I'm going to kick off and then I'm going to pass over to whoever wants to jump in there. But yes, Christina, the biggest thing for us right now is getting that extension to free school meal eligibility, because you don't stop being hungry when you go to secondary school. And at the moment, you're absolutely right. There's a big focus on primary schools. But, you know, I can tell you now, if I was to choose between universal provision on primary or extending eligibility all the way through the children's lives at school up until 18, I would go the latter. Because you don't stop being poor, you don't stop being hungry when you go to secondary school. So I think you make a really good point. Christina.
That's what Biteback's all about. So we're just a bunch of teenagers. And I think, you know, so we have a mixture of young people. It's not all young people that have experienced hunger. Those have the more, like the most powerful voice, obviously, when it comes to free school meals. But it's really important to have solidarity across like Gen Z, and I think that's what's made climate movements, racial movements, like, you know, gender and, you know, trans LGBTQ plus movements so impactful. It's when there's solidarity. So I think the most important thing is being able to empathize with your peers, and creating movement out of that. And that can be the simplest thing. So when I started my like climate advocacy when I was like 14, it was literally sitting in front of a coach in Trafalgar Square, just not letting cars go by, right? That was what we were doing. We were just sitting in the middle of roads, like just being like, no. And we're doing the same with food now, but just more structured. But you've got to start somewhere. And I think with food, it's really difficult for young people because there hasn't been that example. Like, you know, you've got those leaders with other movements, but again, it's not about leaders, it's about like collective movement, and particularly with something that impacts you so directly. Once you do start speaking up, you find that people listen, they really speak up. We saw that with the Free School Meal campaign. So many people that are famous and have gone on to do great things and been doctors and whatever, were on free school meals. So that's why it went viral, because everyone was like, I was on free school meals and now I've been able to achieve this. So solidarity is really important.
I have one more tea towel, so I just want you to know that please continue to ask questions. Now, who was next, Christine? Yes.
So our organization is really small scale compared to yours, but we're all high school, middle school students, but we're doing similar things in the Philippines actually, although we're from South Korea. So it's called the nutrition program. We provide school meals, at least before COVID-19, we provided them with school meals, breakfast and lunch to students who couldn't afford food. And after COVID, we modified it so that we provided them with food packets so that they could take it home and then cook it in their families. But because of funds, this year we couldn't continue the program. We're actually trying to procure funds from our school's annual fund system. But as you can see, our like small, although we're trying to take action because of the funds, we really cannot take actions right now. Although we have our goal really is to expand our program to a lot more people who are hungry, really, right? And we're focusing on a very small area, so in Labo, which is where our supervisor is from. So there are these regions where, there are these neglected regions where we want to help, but we cannot help. So we want some advice as to how we can, procure funds and expand.
Well,
Sorry, did you say Molpol?
Oh, it's Labo Camarines Norte in the Philippines. It's part of Luzon, the biggest island.
I still think I've been there.
So one quick thing, just to find out whether you're aware of the School Meals Coalition.
Yeah.
Okay, because it's really important that countries join. The UK has not, just pointing that out, which is incredibly frustrating because we've got a good story to tell, a relatively good story to tell. But it's quite interesting to learn from other countries if you want to be part of a global movement and find out where they're doing things well and where government funding has been committed. But I don't know.
I was going to ask.
Yes.
Do you utilize social media?
We do, but not really active on social media.
Okay, well, I think start there because there's one thing young people know.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's social media. So definitely start there. And as I said, lived experiences are so important, and you can do that for free, right? Amplifying voices is so crucial when you're trying to get anyone to empathize. And I'd also say, as Sean said earlier, direct action. Make life difficult for them because it's difficult for them, for the kids, I mean, sorry. And yeah, don't be afraid, because one thing that really frustrates me about campaigning in food is when the government says, no, we're not going to feed hungry kids, you're supposed to be civil and polite about it. But they've just said they're not going to feed hungry kids. Like, that's outrageous. So act outrageously. This is speaking as me, not buyback, by the way. Yeah, I think you should, not be afraid to be angry. Yeah.
And there's something about trying to find the money is not your problem.
Yeah.
This really frustrates me. So many politicians and media and people in the media say to you, but where are you going to find the money? It's like, that's not my problem. My problem is a child too hungry to learn. That's my problem, and that's what I'm going to address. And it's for others to work out where the money comes from. We know that it can appear from nowhere. We found that in COVID. So it can happen. We just have to decide as a nation, do we prioritise children's ability to learn? Do we think it matters that children are hungry? And I think we all agree that it does. So, these guys have got to catch up and they'll find the money.
I'd say when you're going to speak to the people with the decision-making ability, start with your idea, and Stephanie said it before, it has to be based around it's not fair. So whatever it is, nobody will ever agree with something when it's not fair. And then have really good stories that they can imagine, the story of a child having to eat a rubber in a classroom and a razor because they can't get a lunch. And it's really difficult for an adult to look a young person in the eye and say, I'm okay with that actually, and then ignore them. It's a really powerful thing for a young person to say, this is a really upsetting story and it's not fair.
Yeah.
So we've got a question online from one of them, from an audience member watching online, Gemma asking how can somebody get involved with movements like buyback?
So I don't know where she's based, but we do have yearly applications, not actually more than yearly, for our national and local youth boards. But I think the most important thing is just join the digital movement and help raise awareness and just across the board. And if you're not in the UK, start your own thing. Band together with some of your friends and yeah.
Any more online or any more around the table?
A bunch of us did come in late, so I just wanted to ask this question. You probably already addressed it. But the idea of every child, whether they are from a poor family or a more well-off family, having access, and the purpose of doing that, is it just to reduce stigma, or is it also to give those children access to a healthier meal? Are there choices being made by parents of all socioeconomic status that are good or bad? Those are things you may have already covered, but things that I'm wondering about. I'm from the US, and during COVID, I think there are some places, I know my dad's area in Massachusetts, they've made meals available to everybody, all the children, regardless. I don't know how long that will remain. They did it in New York City as well. But I did see a lot of food waste in New York. I was a substitute teacher during COVID, and a lot of the meals came in and then they got to go out. but everybody had access to it, so that was good. Anyway.
And your president is talking about this now.
Good.
Which is very exciting. Not to go over it in great detail, but there are different levels of eligibility. So infants get their meals free, age 4 to 7. That's a government-funded policy. There is a means-tested free school meal that depends on income, which we know is not fit for purpose. And we know almost 1 million children are missing out, living in poverty, but not eligible. And then there's another provision for children with no recourse to public funds, which tends to be an immigration issue. So there are 3 different methods. It's not working well in Britain. You know, we were talking about this earlier. We know that too many children are missing out. We know that the figures tell us that 1 in 3 children living in poverty by the government's own criteria are not eligible for a free school meal, which is nonsense. So we know the system's broken. We need to change it. That's why we're all here and doing this work. On food waste, the one thing I would say, you need to be looking at quality. If the food's going in the bin, it's probably because it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. So there is an issue there, and it's heartbreaking when you see food waste when so many families are going hungry. Does anyone want to add to?
Yeah, I can answer questions. I think Louise could probably talk about value for money in terms of scheme. But I mean, we've come from a position that you don't talk about free school teachers, you don't talk about free school chalkboards, you talk about textbooks and pens and lessons. Right. Why would food be a different part of the day when it's such a crucial thing? And actually, you know, children often say about how they're not going to remember the things they learn in maths. But people talk about their school food. It's such a pivotal part for children's experience and learning with food. We did cover there that packed lunches, so bring home lunches, are not nutritionally worthwhile. I think only 1.5% of them met nutritional standards. They're all ultra processed, so there is value in nutrition. And we also know that by providing everybody in a school with a school paid for lunch, a free school lunch, everybody eats more good food. So it affects not just the well-off who are getting this meal, but the poorer students. They tend to be more likely to eat meals because their peers are sat with them.
But that is your goal, is to have a universal
free school meal. Yeah, and Louise's organisation has just done some new work on this too.
Just to add a final dimension, I think it's clear for those who are kind of working in this space that there are so many different dimensions to the benefit of a universal food offer. You've named one of them very directly in terms of addressing that stigma and then the impact that has in terms of that whole school community's experience of eating together. But one of the angles that we were aware in England is a real gap in terms of the evidence that already existed was what the kind of economic basis for making this investment. And you can imagine that that's kind of a question that the government is keen to have an answer to when they're considering whether or not this is something they should do. So Impact on Urban Health recently commissioned a cost-benefit analysis to basically be able to speak to that economic angle. Mark might want to come with more details again, but essentially what the results, which have only recently been published, have shown that there is a huge return on investment. We modelled across different scenarios in terms of the different thresholds that you might increase to, and it was very clear that in terms of the return of on the kind of impact of people's health outcomes across the lifetime, on the educational attainment, but also on the kind of school food economy. So you're thinking about the kind of the catering industry, the food growing, and all of those benefits that spiral out from that. It was really clear that the case is really strong.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the review, guys.
Rachel, tell us when we need to leave, because we could be here all day.
Well, there's no one coming in next, so
if you're happy to keep asking questions and having the conversation, we're happy to be here.
Yeah.
So
If there's any more questions from anyone, we can take.
This one here.
Two, that's fine.
No, I think you kind of answered before when he was talking, but as you said before, young children, especially 4 to 7, might be more attracted to junk food and towards like fast food and all that. And of course, like they should get nutritional food, as you said, and your campaign to an extent. And I want to thank you for this panel. But I was a bit concerned about the food waste part, especially because I saw that the plate already made. So I'm wondering if maybe like you were doing something about the reducing food waste, or how maybe this change your food waste, or anything about that?
So we did run a project back with Impact on Urban Health right at the beginning of this programme, because we're working quite intensively in schools at the moment, looking at everything that happens in the school dining room. One of the things we did was to measure waste and to have a really good look, a forensic look at what was ending up in the bin. And twofold, often it's sometimes about quality, but it's also sometimes about children not feeling confident about trying new foods. So this is where I get back to that whole school approach. We want the people in the dining hall with the children, encouraging them to try, encouraging their peers to try, and sending out really positive messages around the food. We're also helping children communicate better about food. So in our classes, instead, if they don't try something and they don't like it, that's absolutely fine. But instead of going, "Oh, that's disgusting," we ask them to say, "That's not my favourite." And they're just simple things about changing the conversation in the classroom. If there is waste of a specific meal on the menu that's not popular, that's a relatively easy fix. You can look at the 3-week menu cycle and always talk to the children. You know, it's about getting that intel from the children. Sean mentioned SNAG groups, school nutrition action groups. It's another name for student voice. It's exactly what Christina does. Brings those stories of young people to the decision makers. But waste is often a symptom of poor quality and lack of consultation with young people.
And you find it as well when you talk to young people about, it's often young people not going and getting food, and it's often because of other factors, not to do with the food at all, like Stephanie said before about the counter height, or how noisy the dining environment is, whether they've got long queuing times, whether the lunch time is too short for them to get the meal they want. There's a whole host of things that have to do with the environment that mean that the food doesn't get eaten. But people don't want to waste the food. We find they just haven't been well enabled to enjoy it.
Just
to
add to that as well, the wider food environment tells kids that they're just gross and that they should like burgers instead, right? So that's why Bite Back campaigns across the food systems, because it's way bigger. Like free school meals, or school meals generally, is just the tip of the iceberg. Then you have all these other things that young people are fronted with from literally the day they can, this study came out that showed that kids can recognize fast food signs before their ABCs. So it's like they get them young, and so it's about changing that environment as well as school food, because then there won't be any waste, because they'll love what they're naturally made to love.
And just all those positive messages. In the earlier slide that I showed you in the film, we're talking about engaging children with the healthy stuff. We're not calling it the healthy stuff, obviously, but we're just introducing them to new tastes and flavours at a very early age. There's a very fabulous previous dinner lady who was actually inspiration behind Jamie Oliver's campaign, called Jeanette Orry. And she was a school cook. And she transformed food in her children's school as from what she called muck on a truck, which is what we were serving our kids in my children's school, to beautifully freshly cooked food. And she often spoke to parents who go, "Well, they're never going to eat broccoli," and she used to say, "They'll eat it for me." Because it's about the way you present it, the way you communicate about food, and not demonizing any food. And if you can just change the narrative a bit, it makes a massive difference.
We've touched on this, I think, with the different questions that have been asked, but I have friends back home working on similar projects, and I thought it would be interesting to ask from the policy side specifically what you would suggest, any specific setbacks you've faced that have taught you things, or what you would suggest when proposing policies, so to government agencies, politicians, because I think it's very important to communicate with them. So how do we put the policy talk? So how would you suggest, whether it's technical writing, how would you suggest asking more than just, it's very important, the youth and the advocacy side, but more than just that.
So you need to have a problem, because otherwise why would you be doing it, and be clear on what that problem is. And then you need to see who else is interested in that problem. So that unifying, that single voice of a sector in this case is really powerful. And then you need to ask yourself a few questions when you go and speak to the people. Are you clear what you want? Have you identified the right person to speak to? And then have you got, a good evidence of people supporting you? But then what's often really difficult to answer is, why haven't they done this yet? So that might be because they don't care. That might be because there are other more pressing issues. That might be because, they don't have the power to do it. And in those cases, you have to either make them care, you have to either convince them that that issue is a key one, or if they don't have the power to do it, then you go elsewhere, find other power. If they really don't care and they're stuck, that's when you can do things like turning to media, and the story can become about being ignored and their fault, which is not what politicians in particular would want. So it's having a really clear ask. We have had, so Stephanie mentioned there about whether our ask could be, do we give free school meals to all children in primary school, so children to age 10, or do we base how we distribute the meals on levels of parents' income? So do the poorest kids get the meals first? The reasons for people we had these conversations as a group of campaigners. We weren't clear at the start, and the reason being because for younger children, primary schools are much easier to implement policies. Children don't tend to go off and have lunch in other places. There's smaller kitchens and things, and also the government were more likely to be keen to do that. So perhaps it was an easier win. And that was a debate we had, and it was a legitimate debate. And at the end of it, we decided that we think we should be focused on the income levels rather than the age groups. But that was something that we thrashed out between us, and it took a while. And that's not an easy thing to do, but it was important because then when we actually went to the policymakers, we had one ask and we knew where to take it.
Thank you. So just to add up on the question, so I'm from Nepal. So I'm a school teacher. I was a school teacher before I joined World Food Forum. So I taught in school for 1.5 years, and I used to see that the children get school meal up to class 5 was provided on the daily basis. So, but I could find that the food was not nutritious, and it was junk food. So is there anything you are doing to address this problem globally? And another thing is, what are the example of policies that are prevalent in globally, so which guarantees that children should be provided school meal freely? So are there some examples? Are there some policies? Then I will love to know, and I will love to advocate.
Okay, well, number one, school food standards. We don't allow junk in our schools. Now, I say that with great confidence. However, we know on the ground it's a little bit patchy. But there is policy around what goes into schools and what gets served to children. So that's the first thing. There didn't used to be standards. I think you weren't in the room when I was saying that Jamie Oliver back in the day used to say there's regulation for dog food, but not for children's food. So that's the first thing that needed to change. We know that in the UK, we need to work on inspection, actually making sure that schools are complying with the standards. So we know there's a bit of work to be done there. And then, does anyone else want to answer the question about free, where in the world?
So, yeah, this is some of our first dips into international waters, I suppose. But being part of the Global School Meals Coalition, which is a recent foundation, I think can be a really good driver for change. It's perhaps not surprising, but Sweden and Finland have really good provision and standards. The Biden-Harris administration have just set out plans to provide universal free school meals. I don't know whether that has to go through houses and things or it's a reality, but certainly there's a desire from world leaders in that form. And yet there are lots of countries that have standards like the UK, which are set.
Yeah, I would love to address this issue in my country. So I'm a focal point of World Food Forum for Asia Pacific region as well. So I'm also policing. I am also policy maker in some local governments of Nepal. So I will love to initiate those policies if it is out there. So I'd love to get those kind of examples, links from you.
Yeah, we'll get in touch. I'll give you my details in a bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can send model
Yeah,
policies.
because
and
and
things
through World Food Forum as well. So as a focal point of World Food Forum for Asia Pacific. So if through World Food Forum also, if you want to do more and more, then I'm always ready, and we're always ready to take this program to wider levels.
Fantastic, good to hear. And we agree with you that we shouldn't just be giving children any food.
Yeah.
We should be giving them food that supports their health.
And
We
I
need
want
to
to
address health inequality.
Yeah. I want to add one example that in my school where I taught, used to teach in Nepal. So we even used to feed the food which was prepared, which was grown organically in our school. So that's the kind
Gold
of
standard.
example. So that's the kind of
Gold
steps
standard.
we need to take. So it's a big step, and it needs a lot of reform. But hopefully we go there someday.
Sorry, question. It wasn't a question, but I just some of the questions before, if that's okay. Like I work a lot on adolescent nutrition, and I've worked quite globally, and I just maybe wanted to share a few reflections of what you were talking about earlier as well. And I think that kind of outside of the school meal space, and especially adolescent nutrition, we know that this is an area that is just a gap. Like it's a data gap of what do we actually know about adolescents, what do we know about their dietary needs, what do we know about how they eat. It's a gap in terms of knowing what works outside of school meals. Because as you say, like I've got a 7-year-old, and it's like you just give them food, they eat it or they don't. Like adolescents, their brains are changing, like they're making decisions, and how do those decision-making processes come with like what food choices are available for them and their independence to leave school. So it's really a challenging age. I will just say there are quite a few organizations that are now working more on adolescent nutrition and focusing on that. This year or last year, there was the Lancet report around adolescent nutrition. And it's quite technical, but it was the first time that there was actually kind of an evidence-based report about like how do we look at adolescent nutrition. Sophie can talk more about it. She's speaking on a panel about it tomorrow, but it's kind of 3 parts. Like one is actually what are like the biological needs of adolescents, and the second is the stuff around the food environment. So I think it's quite interesting to see that this is definitely a topic that is emerging, and I would say we're definitely learning more about it, but there are individual organizations that are trying to work on it. And I think just Christina, on your point is that we work with activists and campaigners kind of more global, and that's how we've met some of the BIFAT people. And kind of what we've learned as well is that your example of like sitting in front of a bus is like some of our other youth leaders will just say like we can't do that in our country. And I think we've just learned how important like context is. Even talking about change for some people, they say like we can't talk about change in our country. Like we have one youth leader in Zimbabwe, and he's like we can't talk about change. Like we can't use that word. So they find another word to use. Or they know that because they're living in particularly like hierarchical societies, they can't talk to policymakers in a certain way. So I would say like I think in your case it's like you also know the culture and the context in which you're in. Like the UK, for all its faults, you can just sit in front of a bus and like you can be provocative. You can be provocative to politicians. That's a great thing. And it's like recognizing it's like find the way that it works in your country, and there will be like that differently. And the human stories are definitely universal, but recognizing of like I think some of these more global movements, it is about like every country just has to find like their different way of doing it, because also like you're working with people that are under the age of 18, you don't want to put them at risk. And you don't want to put anyone over 18 at risk, but especially not under 18, and just in terms of like safeguarding. So kind of doing it in the way that they feel comfortable, and like the national, even like the cultural context allows them to kind of be activists and campaigners.
Absolutely spot on. I mean, we fully appreciate that, but I think what is transferable to any culture, to any country, is switching the narrative. If the combative approach can't work because of your circumstance, I'm a big fan of this would be even better if. Our school is doing great work, but it would be even better if. we could do something. How about we look at the food? How about we make our school outstanding by asking the children about food? And it's about creating optimism and opportunity, and not getting a bit of 4x2 and beating them over the head with it, because that sometimes does not work. So it's finding where people are at in their journey and being very solutions based in your thinking. And you're right, the combative approach just does not work some places. So yes, it's sector or country specific.
I think it's the first time that there's an issue as well. Often what young people can do is ask, for want of a better phrase, stupid, not to say young people ask, but stupid questions, and pretend to be naive. Say, oh, I just don't understand why that's like that. And there's no agenda, there's no asking for a thing, there's no demand. You can just say, oh, that's confusing. I didn't think that was normal. And then it just starts a conversation. And then, if it's shut down and there are other circumstances, fine, but often that's a really powerful tool that a young person can use. It's just,
can you help me understand why this is so? Yeah. And often they can't. Yeah. Any more questions from anyone? Anything online?
no more.
Okay.
Contact, but
Okay.
good online.
How can someone get involved or support this movement such as Bite Back?
We've had that
Got
one.
that one.
Yes.
Thank you.
Cool.
Thank
Well,
you.
I'll leave it to you guys to wrap up and then we'll end the session.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for asking excellent questions, for listening to everything we've had to say, and go forth. It is possible, whether it's a pushy parent or a really fed up teenager. Change can happen, and I think it's important to know that. And just, if it's not fair, say so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
We're gonna upload the. Can we still upload after anything?
So you've been
Yeah.
crossing your left foot.
No.
Yeah, just wait.
Nobody is only here, so that is also not in the wide scale, but it's in the small scale. Because we cannot go all the kids from the school garden. So it's only limited, but still I would say it's going on.
You didn't see the film, did you?
No, I mean, I don't know.
Okay, because we showed the film for school garden for children going there. It's just, even if it's not going to be much in school, but it can be year 2 or 3 potatoes and those things.
Yeah,
That's a really beautiful message.
Yeah.
And you have children.
Yeah, so you guys are
Yeah, actually work with I work with from the word basically it's like in-person teaching, but the action. Basically the children and
like we did.
Cool. That's great.
So let's make some sense.
Yeah, this is why I want when they were asking the question. It's mostly like where you can go and ask, and they're like, yeah, just like this, and then to do like